The water was black as midnight when Ezekiel first touched it. Cold enough to steal the breath from his lungs, but not cold enough to steal his resolve to be free. This is the story of a man who understood that between him and liberation lay not just miles of river, but an entire system designed to convince him he was less than human, and how he proved them devastatingly wrong. If you want to follow more stories of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit that refused to be chained, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Now, let me take you back to 1858, to the shores of Virginia, where one man's impossible dream of freedom began with a single step into dangerous waters. Ezekiel was 32 years old, though he had stopped counting birthdays long ago because enslaved people were not supposed to measure their own time, only the time they owed to others. He worked on the Hartwell plantation, a sprawling tobacco farm that stretched along the James River, and he had worked there since he was 6 years old, brought there after being sold away from his mother in South Carolina. He never saw her again, but he never forgot her face or the last words she whispered to him. "You are more than what they say you are. Remember that, baby. You are whole." For 26 years, Ezekiel had survived by being what they called a good worker, which meant he kept his head down, did his labor without complaint, and never showed the fire that burned constantly in his chest. But good behavior was not the same as acceptance. Every single day, Ezekiel studied the world around him with the precision of a scholar, memorizing patrol routes, understanding the tides of the river, learning which overseers drank too much and which ones never slept. He was building a map in his mind, not of land, but of possibility. Intelligence was his first weapon, patience his second, and hope, however fragile, was the thing that kept both sharp. The Hartwell plantation was ruled by Clayton Hartwell, a man who considered himself a benevolent enslaver, which was a contradiction so absurd it would be laughable if it were not so dangerous. He believed that because he did not whip his slaves as frequently as his neighbors, because he allowed them Sunday afternoons for rest, because he sometimes gave extra rations at Christmas, he was somehow kind. But Ezekiel knew the truth. There is no kindness in ownership, no mercy in bondage. Hartwell's cruelty was quieter than most, but it was cruelty nonetheless, the kind that smiled while it stole your humanity piece by piece. Ezekiel shared a cabin with 7 other enslaved men, including his closest friend Moses, who was 50 years old and had been born on this very plantation. Moses had seen 3 generations of Hartwells come and go, had buried 2 wives and 4 children, all sold away or worked to death. Despite all this, Moses had not lost his spirit, only learned to hide it deeper. At night, when the overseers were gone and the only light came from the small fire in the cabin, Moses would tell stories of Africa, passed down from his grandfather, stories of kingdoms and warriors, of people who were free. "We come from greatness, Ezekiel," Moses would say. "Don't ever let them make you forget that." But there was someone else in Ezekiel's life who shaped his understanding of freedom even more profoundly. A woman named Dinah. She worked in the main house as a cook, which meant she heard things, overheard conversations between Hartwell and his guests, between his wife and her friends, between the overseers planning their routes. Dinah was 40 years old, sharp as a blade, and had been gathering information for decades. She could not read or write, as it was illegal to teach enslaved people, but she had a memory that could hold 1,000 details and never drop one. She and Ezekiel had been planning something for 2 years, ever since they both realized they would rather die trying to be free than live another decade in chains. The plan was impossible, which is exactly why it might work. The James River connected to the Chesapeake Bay, which connected to the Atlantic Ocean. There were routes, underground networks, people who helped runaways, but getting to them required crossing water, lots of water. Ezekiel had taught himself to swim in secret in the early morning hours before dawn, when he was supposed to be checking the tobacco fields near the river. He would slip into the water, teaching his body to move through it, teaching his lungs to control panic, teaching himself that water could be freedom instead of death. Most enslaved people did not know how to swim because slavers knew water was an escape route, and so they used fear of drowning as another chain. The night Ezekiel decided to run was not chosen randomly. It was late September, when the moon would be dark, when the harvest was demanding so much attention that the overseers were exhausted and less vigilant, when the water temperature was still manageable before winter cold set in. Dinah had told him 3 days earlier that Hartwell was planning to sell 4 men to a plantation in Georgia, men who had been causing what he called disruptions, which really meant they had started asking questions about being paid for their work. Ezekiel knew it was only a matter of time before he would be sold too, before Moses would be sold, before everything he knew would be ripped away again. He could not wait any longer. He told Moses the plan. Moses looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything, but also too much suffering to discourage hope. "I am too old to swim miles, Ezekiel. My body is broken. But you go. You swim for both of us. You get free and you remember our names, you hear me? You tell the world we were here, that we mattered, that we were human." Ezekiel gripped the old man's shoulder, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle onto him like a mantle. He would carry not just his own freedom, but the memory of everyone who could not run, everyone who had died here, everyone whose names were lost. That weight did not make him slower. It made him stronger. Dinah gave him the final piece he needed, a route. She had been talking to other enslaved people who worked on neighboring plantations, creating a network of information that Hartwell would never suspect existed, because he could not imagine that the people he owned were capable of such organization. "There is a place 15 miles downriver where the current will carry you faster. From there you swim another 20 miles to an inlet where there are people who will hide you. Quakers, they will get you north." 35 miles of swimming. It sounded impossible. Ezekiel smiled. Impossible is just another word for something they do not want us to believe we can do. The night he left, Ezekiel did not say goodbye to anyone except Moses and Dinah, because the fewer people who knew, the safer they would be. He wrapped his few possessions, a tin cup and a small piece of cloth that had belonged to his mother, in oilskin that Dinah had stolen from the main house. He tied it tight around his waist. Then, just after midnight, when the camp was silent and the overseers were drunk or asleep, Ezekiel walked calmly to the river as if he belonged there, as if he were just checking something. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest, but his face showed nothing. Control was survival. The water was colder than he expected, and darker, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and sight. For a moment, standing on the bank, Ezekiel felt the full terror of what he was about to do. He could drown. He could be caught. He could be killed. The punishment for running was brutal, public, designed to terrify everyone else into obedience. But then he remembered his mother's words. Remembered Moses' stories, remembered every single day of his life spent being told he was property, and the terror transformed into something else entirely. Fury. Righteous. Clarifying fury at a system that demanded he accept his own dehumanization. He stepped into the water, let it rise to his chest, and then began to swim. The first mile was the hardest, because his body had to adjust to the cold, to the rhythm, to the knowledge that there was no turning back. Ezekiel swam with steady, controlled strokes, the way he had practiced in secret for 2 years. He did not thrash or panic. He conserved energy, let the current help him when it could, fought it when he had to. His mind went into a meditative state, focusing only on the next stroke, the next breath, the next moment. He did not think about the miles ahead. He thought only about motion, about the feel of water against skin, about the fact that every stroke was taking him farther from bondage. When the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, Ezekiel had been swimming for nearly 5 hours and had covered approximately 10 miles. His muscles were screaming, his fingers were numb, his lips were cracked from the salt mixing into the river water as he got closer to the bay. But he could not stop. Daylight meant patrols, meant dogs, meant men on horseback searching the riverbanks. He had to reach the inlet before full daylight, or everything would be lost. So he pushed harder, ignored the pain, ignored the exhaustion, ignored the voice in his head that said this was impossible. Impossible is what they want me to believe, he whispered to himself, to the water, to the ancestors he felt swimming beside him. By noon, Ezekiel had covered 25 miles. He was hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing shapes in the water that were not there, hearing voices that were only in his mind. His body was shutting down, hypothermia setting in despite his efforts. He knew he was close to the inlet. Dinah's directions had been precise, but he did not know if he could make the final miles. That is when he heard it. Dogs barking in the distance, the sound of men shouting. The patrol had discovered he was missing and they were searching the river. Ezekiel felt a spike of adrenaline cut through the exhaustion. He dove under the water, stayed there as long as his lungs could hold, came up only for quick gasps of air, then dove again. He became part of the river, invisible, determined. The dogs reached the bank where Ezekiel had been just minutes before. The patrollers, 5 white men armed with rifles and whips, scanned the water. One of them pointed. "There, I see something." But it was only a log, floating downstream. They argued among themselves about whether anyone could actually swim this far, whether Ezekiel had drowned already, whether they should continue searching or give up. Ezekiel, hidden beneath the surface of the water near the opposite bank, his lungs burning, listened to them debate his life as if it were a trivial thing. Finally, one of them said, "No slave swims 30 miles. He is dead. The river took him. Let's head back." And just like that they left, assuming water had done what they could not. Ezekiel surfaced slowly, gasping, crying, laughing all at once. They had given up. They assumed he was dead, which meant they would not keep looking. He had done it. He had swum so far that they could not even conceive of it, had made himself into something their limited imaginations could not account for, a man who refused to accept their definition of possible. But he was not free yet. He still had 10 more miles to the inlet, and his body was failing. Every muscle was cramping, his vision was blurred, his core temperature was dangerously low. But Ezekiel had not come this far to die within reach of freedom. He thought of Moses, pictured the old man's face, heard his voice saying, "Swim for both of us." He thought of Dinah, risking everything to gather information, to create pathways for others. He thought of his mother, sold away, lost forever, but whose love had planted a seed of resistance in him that no amount of brutality could dig out. He thought of all the people whose names he did not know, who had died in those fields, who had been broken by the system, who deserved to be remembered as fully human. And he swam, stroke after stroke, breath after breath, mile after mile, refusing to let his body quit because his spirit was stronger than flesh, stronger than cold, stronger than the entire apparatus of slavery that said he should not even want to be free. When Ezekiel finally reached the inlet, it was late afternoon. He saw the small dock that Dinah had described, the weathered barn just beyond it, the lantern hanging in the window that signaled safety. He pulled himself onto the muddy shore and collapsed, unable to move another inch. His body had given everything it had. For several minutes, he just lay there, half in the water, half on land, crying and shaking. Then he heard footsteps and a voice, an older white woman's voice speaking softly. "You made it. Dear God, you actually made it. Come inside quickly before anyone sees." The woman's name was Rebecca, and she and her husband Thomas were Quakers who had been helping freedom seekers for 15 years. They pulled Ezekiel inside the barn. wrapped him in blankets, gave him warm broth and bread. Rebecca wept as she looked at him. 35 miles, she kept saying. 35 miles through that water. I have seen many brave souls come through here, but I have never heard of anyone swimming that far. You are a miracle. But Ezekiel shook his head weakly. Not a miracle, ma'am. Just a man who decided he would rather die free than live in chains. That is not a miracle. That is what we all would do if we could. Over the next 3 days, Ezekiel recovered enough strength to continue his journey north. Thomas and Rebecca connected him with the Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and brave conductors who would guide him to Pennsylvania, then to New York, then eventually to Canada, where he would be truly beyond the reach of the Fugitive Slave Act. But before he left, Ezekiel asked Rebecca for paper and a pen. "I cannot write," he admitted. "But I need you to write something for me. I need you to write down the names Moses and Dinah and the names of everyone I can remember from that plantation. I need you to write that they were there, that they mattered, that they were human beings who deserved freedom too." Rebecca wrote every name Ezekiel gave her. 17 names in total, people who had been erased from official records, reduced to inventory numbers in ledgers, but who Ezekiel carried in his memory as fully realized human beings with dreams and dignity. "I will keep this paper," Rebecca promised, "and I will make sure their names are not forgotten." Ezekiel nodded, satisfied. That was part of freedom too. The freedom to be remembered, to have your humanity acknowledged, to exist in history as more than property. He had swum 35 miles for his own liberation, but he carried the weight of 17 souls with him, and he would honor that burden for the rest of his life. Ezekiel reached Canada 6 weeks later, settling in a small community of other freedom seekers near Toronto. He learned to read and write, worked as a carpenter, eventually married a woman named Grace, who had also escaped from Virginia. They had 4 children, and Ezekiel told them every single day that they were born free, that no one owned them, that they were whole and complete and human. But he also told them about Moses, about Dinah, about the 17 names written on paper in a Quaker home in Virginia. "Never forget where you came from," he would say. "Never forget the price of freedom or the people who did not make it out. We owe them our memory." In 1863, when news reached Canada that President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Ezekiel was 57 years old. He stood in the church with hundreds of other formerly enslaved people, and they sang and cried and celebrated. But even in that moment of joy, Ezekiel thought about the ones who did not live to see it, the ones who died believing freedom would never come. "This is for you, Moses," he whispered. "This is for you, Dinah. This is for Mama. This is for all of you." And in that moment, Ezekiel understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of memory, the insistence on dignity, the refusal to let suffering be meaningless. Ezekiel lived until 1891. Dying at the age of 65, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, all of them free, all of them educated, all of them carrying forward the legacy of resistance and resilience he had embodied. His story was written down by his eldest daughter, Naomi, who became a teacher and historian, determined to document the stories of people like her father, people whose courage had been written out of official narratives. She titled her manuscript, "The Man Who Swam to Freedom," and in it, she wrote, "My father was not superhuman. He was simply human in the fullest sense, refusing to accept anything less than the dignity he was born with. That is not a story of miracles. That is a story of what we are all capable of when we decide our humanity is not negotiable." The story of Ezekiel is not unique in its broad strokes. Thousands of enslaved people risked everything for freedom, used rivers and waterways as escape routes, swam impossible distances, endured unimaginable hardship. But each story is unique in its particulars, in the specific courage of specific individuals, in the names and faces and dreams that deserve to be remembered. Ezekiel's story reminds us that resistance took many forms, that intelligence and planning were as important as physical strength, that community and connection sustained people through the darkest times, and that freedom was not given, it was taken, claimed, fought for with every ounce of strength and will that people possessed. What makes Ezekiel's story particularly powerful is what it reveals about the psychology of oppression and resistance. The system of slavery was designed not just to extract labor, but to convince enslaved people that they were less than human, that they were incapable of self-determination, that they were naturally suited to bondage. Every aspect of that system, from the laws to the violence to the ideology, was constructed to make resistance seem impossible and freedom seem unattainable. But Ezekiel, like countless others, rejected that psychological prison. He studied, planned, prepared, and when the moment came, he acted. His escape was not impulsive or desperate. It was strategic, calculated, the result of years of observation and preparation. That takes extraordinary intelligence and self-control. Moreover, Ezekiel's story illustrates the importance of community in resistance. He did not escape alone, even though he swam alone. He escaped because Moses gave him stories and belief, because Dinah gave him information and roots, because Rebecca and Thomas provided sanctuary, because an entire network of people, enslaved and free, black and white, decided that freedom mattered more than safety. Slavery sought to isolate people, to break bonds of family and community, to make everyone too afraid to trust anyone else. But people resisted that too, building networks of care and communication that slavers could never fully destroy. Ezekiel's freedom was his own achievement, but it was made possible by collective resistance. The question of memory is central to understanding stories like Ezekiel's. For generations, the history of slavery in America was told primarily from the perspective of slaveholders, or was sanitized and minimized, or was reduced to a footnote in a larger narrative of national progress. The humanity, intelligence, creativity, and resistance of enslaved people was erased or diminished. But those people existed. They had names, faces, dreams, families, talents, beliefs. They were poets and strategists, builders and healers, parents and children. They were fully human, and they deserve to be remembered as such. When we tell stories like Ezekiel's, we are not just recounting historical facts. We are engaging in an act of restoration, insisting that these lives mattered, that their struggles and triumphs are central to the American story, not peripheral to it. There is also something profoundly important about the specificity of Ezekiel's method of escape. Swimming. Water has deep symbolic and practical significance in African American history. During slavery, rivers were both barriers and pathways, sources of death and sources of liberation. The Middle Passage itself was a horrific journey across water, a trauma that shaped generations. But water also became a route to freedom, as people like Ezekiel used rivers, swamps, and coastlines to evade capture. There is a spiritual dimension to this as well. Water as baptism, as rebirth, as transformation. When Ezekiel entered that river, he was entering a liminal space between slavery and freedom, between death and life, between who he had been forced to be and who he truly was. 35 miles of swimming was not just physical endurance, it was a ritual of transformation. It is crucial to emphasize that Ezekiel's story, while inspiring, is also a story about the brutal reality of what freedom cost. He had to leave behind people he loved, knowing he might never see them again. He had to risk death by drowning, by cold, by capture. He had to carry the psychological weight of trauma and loss. Freedom was not a simple happy ending. It was the beginning of a new set of challenges. Building a life in a new place, dealing with ongoing racism and discrimination even in the North, living with the memories of what had been endured. We honor the courage of people like Ezekiel, not by romanticizing their suffering, but by acknowledging the full complexity of their experiences, the losses as well as the gains, the ongoing struggle for dignity and justice even after the chains were broken. Ezekiel's story also raises important questions about what we owe to the past and to the people whose sacrifices made our present possible. He insisted that the names of those who could not escape be remembered, that their humanity be acknowledged. That is a charge that extends to us generations later. We owe it to people like Moses and Dinah, to the millions whose names we will never know, to tell the truth about what happened, to teach the full history, to resist efforts to sanitize or minimize the horror of slavery and the heroism of those who resisted it. Memory is not just about the past, it is about how we understand ourselves in the present and what we commit to in the future. There is a tendency in American culture to prefer stories of individual triumph, to celebrate the exceptional person who overcomes impossible odds. Ezekiel's story can fit that narrative, and there is value in recognizing individual courage. But it is equally important to recognize that Ezekiel was not exceptional in his desire for freedom or in his willingness to risk everything for it. What made his escape possible was not that he was uniquely talented or brave, but that he was part of a long tradition of resistance, part of a community that shared knowledge and resources, part of a larger movement toward liberation. He was extraordinary in what he accomplished, but ordinary in his fundamental humanity and in his refusal to accept bondage. That ordinariness is important because it reminds us that resistance is not the domain of superheroes or saints. It is the work of regular people who decide that enough is enough. The story of Ezekiel swimming 35 miles to freedom is ultimately a story about the power of the human spirit to refuse dehumanization. The entire system of slavery was predicated on the lie that black people were somehow less than fully human, that they could be owned, bought, sold, and used without moral consequence. But every act of resistance, from the smallest gesture of defiance to the most dramatic escape, was a refutation of that lie. When Ezekiel dove into that river, he was not just escaping bondage, he was asserting his full humanity, his right to self-determination, his refusal to accept anyone else's definition of who he was or what he was capable of. That assertion cost him dearly, but it was worth everything because it was the assertion of his essential human dignity. In the years since slavery was abolished, there have been ongoing struggles for civil rights, for equality, for justice. The legal chains were broken, but systems of oppression adapted and persisted in new forms. The fight that Ezekiel and millions of others began did not end with emancipation. It continued through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, through every generation that has demanded recognition of full humanity and equal protection under law. Ezekiel's swim was one stroke in a much longer journey, a journey that is still ongoing. When we remember his story, we are not just looking backward, we are connecting past struggles to present ones, understanding that the work of freedom is never finished, that each generation must take up the task of building a more just world. What can we learn from Ezekiel's story today? We can learn that resistance is always possible, even in systems designed to make it seem impossible. We can learn that intelligence, planning, and community are powerful tools against oppression. We can learn that freedom is not given freely. It must be claimed and defended. We can learn that memory matters, that the names and stories of those who came before us deserve to be preserved and honored. We can learn that human dignity is not something that can be taken away by laws or violence or ideology. It is inherent. And the struggle to have that dignity recognized is one of the most fundamental struggles of human existence. And we can learn that ordinary people, when pushed to the limits of endurance, are capable of extraordinary acts of courage. As we close this story, think about Ezekiel in that river. 35 miles of cold, dark water between him and freedom, every stroke an act of defiance, every breath a refusal to give up. Think about Moses, too old to run but strong enough to believe, telling stories of greatness to keep hope alive. Think about Dinah, gathering information in the master's house, turning her position of servitude into a position of power through knowledge and careful planning. Think about Rebecca and Thomas, risking their own safety to provide sanctuary to strangers. Think about all the unnamed people who made small acts of resistance every single day, who passed down stories and strategies, who refused to let the spirit be broken even when the body was chained. Freedom is not just a political condition or a legal status. Freedom is a way of being in the world, a refusal to internalize oppression, a commitment to living with dignity and demanding recognition of one's full humanity. Ezekiel achieved legal freedom when he reached Canada, but he had claimed his essential freedom the moment he decided that no human being had the right to own him, the moment he began planning his escape, the moment he stepped into that river. The journey was long, and the water was cold, and the outcome was uncertain. But the decision to be free, that was made in his heart and mind long before his body followed. That internal freedom, that unbreakable core of self-knowledge and self-worth, is what slavery could never fully destroy, no matter how brutal it became. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage, dignity, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you can hear more stories that honor the complexity and power of human experience. Share this story with others who need to remember that resistance has always existed, that people have always fought for their freedom, that the struggle for justice is as old as injustice itself. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most about Ezekiel's journey, what lessons you take from it, how it connects to struggles for dignity and freedom in our own time. These stories matter. These names matter. These lives matter. And remembering them is one of the most important things we can do to honor their legacy and continue the work they began. Until the next story, remember, freedom is not given. It is taken, claimed, and defended, and the courage to be free lives in every human heart that refuses to accept anything less than dignity.